The Ash Shroud of Campania, 79 AD. The catastrophe that turned the flourishing coastline of Campania into a mass grave in just 30 hours began on an ordinary August day, 79 AD. Romans were carefree, drinking cheap wine, arguing politics, and completely ignoring the picturesque mountain on the horizon. The mountain was called Vesuvius. The locals thought it was just a hill, an ordinary mound of earth with vineyards. A colossal, fatal mistake. The volcano had been dormant for hundreds of years, and then it woke up, and it did so with the utmost spectacularity. On August 23rd, the mountain's summit simply exploded. The sound of the impact tore through the crater, and a monstrous column of superheated gas and ash shot into the sky. It rose to a height of over 30 kilometers. The earth trembled. The sky turned black in broad daylight. Every second, this hellish crater spat out up to 1.5 million tons of molten rock. 1.5 million tons. Every second. The physics of this nightmare are astounding. The force of the explosion was approximately 100,000 times greater than the atomic bomb that obliterated Hiroshima. Pure energy of destruction. Rich, bustling cities stood near the volcano. Pompeii and Herculaneum, resorts for the Roman elite, villas, theaters, marble baths. The volcano reduced all this splendor to dust in a matter of hours. People panicked too late. Many decided to wait out the catastrophe in their homes. Fools. Red-hot pumice crashed through roofs right above their heads. Forget slow-moving lava. Pyroclastic flows lashed the cities. These are deadly avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and rock debris. They rushed toward the coast at breakneck speed, scorching everything in their path. The temperature inside this cloud instantly evaporated the water in people's bodies. People died in a split second, suffocating from the toxic fumes. The irony of nature is boundless. The tragedy of thousands of Romans turned into a major gift for modern archaeology. A multi-meter layer of ash preserved the cities. Death created the perfect time capsule. The ashes preserve houses, frescoes, loaves of bread in ovens, and even the poses of the unfortunate victims in their final moments. For nearly 2,000 years, these ruins slept underground, so that today we can cynically contemplate someone else's nightmare on our smartphone screens. Nature obliterated civilization in passing, simply because it could. The Antonine and Cyprian demographic collapses, 165 and 251 CE. The epidemics that turned the great Roman Empire into a giant open-air morgue in the 2nd and 3rd centuries began with the simple greed of war. 165 CE. Roman legions successfully plunder the Parthian kingdom in the east. They drag home gold, slaves, and one tiny but deadly souvenir, an invisible passenger. Most likely, it was common smallpox or measles. For the unfearing Romans, with zero immunity, this contagion was a one-way ticket. Soldiers returned along the perfect Roman roads, generously sharing germs with everyone they met. The symptoms were horrific. Wild fever, black sores on the skin, rapid exhaustion. People simply rotted alive in their homes. Between 5 and 10 million citizens died. A full-blown demographic catastrophe. The economy collapsed. Trade routes with India and Asia were paralyzed. There was no one to collect taxes. The Roman army lost half its personnel. There was no one left to guard the borders, and the barbarians across the river began to gleefully rub their hands. Rome was tottering. Do you think they learned their lesson? Humanity never learns from mistakes. Less than a century passes, 251 AD. A new wave of death engulfs the empire. It was called the Plague of Cyprian, named after the bishop of Carthage who left detailed memoirs of this nightmare. Witnesses described utter hell. Eyes were bloodshot. Stomachs turned inside out. Gangrene of the limbs set in. People went mad en masse from the pain. In Rome alone, up to 5,000 corpses were carried out daily. 5,000 coffins every day. Alexandria lost more than half its population. Of 500,000 inhabitants, only about 190,000 remained. Panic paralyzed the government. Emperor Decius came up with nothing more clever than to demand mass sacrifices from the citizens to the Roman gods. But the local Christians refused to slaughter sheep for pagan idols. Decius immediately found scapegoats. He accused Christians of inciting the wrath of the gods and launched a brutal hunt against them. Instead of a sensible quarantine, the empire faced mass executions, terror, and civil war amid total devastation. A brilliant example of crisis management. The Cretan Megaseism and Tsunami, 365 AD. The catastrophe that wiped out the ports of the eastern Mediterranean in a single morning began at dawn on July 21st, 365 AD. The ground beneath the Romans shook. An underwater tectonic fault off the coast of Crete ruptured with a monstrous crack. Seismologists today estimate the magnitude of this impact at over 8.5. The enormous island of Crete literally leaped out of the water, lifting it 9 meters into the air. 9 meters of monolithic stone shot skyward in a matter of minutes. The ancient harbor in the city of Phalasarna instantly emerged on dry land, hundreds of meters from the shoreline. The Romans awoke to find their moorings on a hill. Nature had rewritten the geographical map of the region with one powerful kick. But the real fun came later. A powerful shock generated a gigantic wave. At first, the sea retreated treacherously. The water receded from the shores, exposing the seabed. Deep gorges and valleys were revealed. Frightened fish and sea creatures thrashed in the mud. The residents of Alexandria, instead of fleeing to the hills, joyfully trudged to the exposed seabed. Human stupidity knows no bounds. They collected fish by hand, joyfully shouted to one another, shared dinner plans, and then the ocean returned. A colossal wall of water crashed onto the coast with the roar of a wounded beast. The wave obliterated the coastal cities. Alexandria was simply smeared. The royal palace sank beneath the waves. Enormous ships were tossed onto the roofs of surviving buildings, and some were carried 2 miles inland. Tens of thousands of people drowned within a couple of hours. Alexandrians remembered that day for centuries as a day of horror. The destroyed embankments were only the beginning of the end. A tectonic shock unleashed global political chaos. At the same time, nomadic Hun tribes began to move from the depths of Asia. They marched west, sweeping away everything in their path. Frightened Goths and Vandals, fleeing this horde, rushed across the Roman borders. Weakened by a tsunami and famine, the empire was unable to withstand the onslaught. Barbarians settled the Roman provinces. It all ended as expected. 378 AD. The Battle of Adrianople. The Goths utterly routed the Roman army. Emperor Valens died in a heap of corpses. Great Rome suffered a mortal wound from which it never recovered. A single crack in the ocean triggered the fall of the empire. The Justinian Climatic Catastrophe, 536 AD. The climate collapse that turned 536 AD into the most horrific period for life on the planet began suddenly. People awoke in the morning and saw no sunrise. The sun shone dimly, as if through a dirty, dull glass. Historians call this the beginning of a catastrophic volcanic winter. The cause turned out to be trivial. Several colossal volcanic eruptions threw enormous volumes of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere. This dense gas curtain blocked out sunlight for 18 months. Half the planet was plunged into eternal twilight. Temperatures dropped several degrees. Summer was simply canceled. Instead of harvest ripening, people witnessed snowfalls in mid-July. Nature had unleashed a global ice age without warning. The society of that time was entirely dependent on agriculture. Without sun, wheat and barley rotted in the ground across Eurasia. A severe famine ensued. People slaughtered livestock in mass. They ate tree bark. Granaries were emptied. In search of any food, entire populations uprooted their homes and went plundering their neighbors. Anarchy reigned everywhere. Trade relations collapsed instantly. But this chaos was only a modest prelude to the real nightmare. The real horror lay ahead for the exhausted population. Hungry people with weak immune systems are the perfect incubator for any infection. Deadly bacteria took full advantage of this opportunity. The first pandemic of the bubonic plague arrived. It went down in history under the name of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. The disease spread like wildfire along deserted trade routes. Infected rats and fleas swarmed the cities. Thousands died daily in Constantinople. There was no one and nowhere to bury the dead. Corpses were simply dumped in empty defensive towers or thrown over cliffs into the sea. The plague wiped out about a third of the Byzantine Empire's population. The great ruler Justinian dreamed of restoring Rome's former glory. He assembled vast armies and built majestic temples. But all his ambitions crumbled to dust due to a sulfur cloud in the sky and microscopic bacteria in the blood of his subjects. The empire was left without soldiers or taxpayers. A great dream turned to ruins. Nature once again demonstrated humanity's utter insignificance. The Yellow Plague of Britain and the death of Muhammad, 632 and 664 CE. The Yellow Plague epidemic and the political upheaval in the Middle East, which transformed the 7th century into a mass survival exercise, began simultaneously in opposite corners of the world. Britain, 664 CE. A solar eclipse occurs. The locals crawl in panic through the mud, awaiting the end of the world. Heaven decides to punish them for real. A plague known as the Yellow Plague creeps into Kent. It was likely bubonic plague, but it earned its colorful name because of the hideous skin color of those infected. The disease spread rapidly. Monasteries were hit particularly hard. At the time, they were the only places where anyone could read anything more complex than promissory notes. The plague decimated centers of learning. The historian Bede the Venerable described how, at the monastery of Rath Melsigi, an epidemic laid almost all the brothers to their deathbeds. The surviving Egbert took a vow of eternal exile, vowing never to return to his homeland if he survived. He was lucky. The others were not. The plague wiped out a third of the population of Britain and Ireland. The kings of Essex, Sire, and Sabie decided that the Christian God had broken down and unanimously returned to paganism. Astonishing logic. If there is no protection, one must slaughter chickens on Odin's altar again. While people in Northern Europe were turning yellow and dying, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the scorching Middle East. It was the year 632 AD. The Prophet Muhammad was dying in Medina. The man who had managed to unite disparate tribes under a single banner had passed away without an heir or clear instructions for the succession. Human stupidity and the lust for power instantly filled this vacuum. The Arabian tribes, who had yesterday sworn allegiance to the new faith, decided their obligations were annulled. They refused to pay taxes. The survival of the caliphate was at stake. A series of bloody conflicts began, known as the Ridda Wars. The new leaders in Medina had no intention of releasing the taxpayers. They drenched the peninsula in blood, forcibly returning the fugitives. This public flogging united the survivors and created a professional military machine. The Muslim army, forged in these internecine conflicts, surged beyond the desert. They wiped Persia from the map and took half of Byzantium's lands. The death of one man set off a chain reaction that redrew the world map. Chaos gave birth to an empire. The Abbasid purge of the Great Zab, 750 CE. The bloody change of power in the Middle East, ending with the brutal extermination of the ruling Umayyad dynasty, began in January 750 CE on the banks of the Great Zab. Until then, Damascus had ruled the region. The Umayyads sat on golden coffers, collected taxes, and imagined their greatness would last forever. But history had other plans. In the east, their mortal enemies, the Abbasids, raised their black banners. They gathered under their wing all the disgruntled, discontented, and hungry. In the decisive battle on the Great Zab, the vast army of the old Caliph Marwan II suffered a crushing defeat. The Caliph himself fled in panic to Egypt, where he was quickly caught and shortened by a head. But the new government understood perfectly well. The weed must be pulled out by the roots. No one who has even a drop of royal blood in his veins can be left alive. After the military victory, what historians would call the Feast of Blood began. A perfect demonstration of human treachery and naivety. The Abbasid leader, Abu al-Abbas, decided to settle the dispute civilly. He invited the 80 surviving princes of the Umayyad line to a sumptuous banquet. The pretext was reconciliation, forgiveness, and a general amnesty. And guess what? They believed him. 80 grown men, seasoned intriguers, donned their finest clothes and came to visit their executioners. They sat at tables, anticipating a hearty meal. But instead of hot dishes, Abu al-Abbas served them death. At the master's signal, servants burst into the hall with heavy wooden clubs. They began methodically slaughtering the guests right at the tables. Without unnecessary noise or noble duels, simply the dull thuds of wood against skulls. Then came the cynicism of the highest order. The princes, still alive, wheezing and bleeding, were piled in a heap on the floor. Enormous leather rugs were placed on top of them, and right onto these rugs, beneath which the people writhing in agony, servants began carrying food for the Abbasids. The victors sat quietly to dine, listening to the muffled groans of their dying enemies beneath their feet. They drank wine and ate meat while the last breaths of the Umayyad dynasty faded beneath the leather carpeting. This is realpolitik without the gloss. Of this entire vast family, only one prince managed to survive, Abd al-Rahman I. The young man miraculously escaped across the desert to Spain, where he founded his own emirate. And the new regime in Baghdad erased the old capital from memory and began building its golden age on the bones of its predecessors. The same absolute control, the same taxes, just under a different brand. Human nature does not change. The Great Heathen Host, 865 AD. The invasion of a gigantic pagan horde that forever turned the flourishing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain into a scorched desert began in the autumn of 865 AD. Previously, ordinary bearded bandits would sail to the locals. They would plunder a monastery, kill a few monks, take the silver, and sail off to drink ale. That was the cost of life by the sea. But now the rules of the game had changed dramatically. Something fundamentally new had crawled ashore. A vast, disciplined, and incredibly evil coalition of various Scandinavian tribes. Chroniclers, horrified, dubbed this rabble the Great Heathen Host. They didn't come to plunder. They came to take this land. Forever. At the helm of this death machine stood the three sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Utterly deranged characters, driven by a thirst for vengeance for their father, whom the English had thrown into a pit of snakes. They began a methodical, cold-blooded conquest of the island. For 14 years, these nice people turned Britain into hell on earth. Kingdoms fell, one after another. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, all were reduced to heaps of smoking ruins. Local rulers, instead of uniting in the face of total annihilation, continued to squabble over tiny plots of land and betray one another. Viking axes quickly taught them the error of their ways. Local dynasties were slaughtered root and branch. Monasteries were burned along with their ancient books, and the population was enslaved. But yesterday's conquerors quickly turned into ordinary, boring farmers. Having acquired land in the north and east of England, they founded the Danelaw, an area of Danish law, and simply settled down to grow turnips. Only King Alfred of Wessex, later known as the Great, was able to resist this avalanche. He holed up in the swamps, reorganized his army, and began a grueling guerrilla war. If not for his stubbornness, the English language today would sound like a mixture of Old Norse and grunts. Only the threat of total annihilation can force people to unite. The history of Wessex proved this once again. The fall of the golden age of the Tang dynasty, 907 CE. The fall of the greatest Eastern empire, considered the pinnacle of civilization for nearly 300 years, ended in 907 CE with a simple betrayal and a mountain of ash. The Tang dynasty, China's golden age, an era when poets wrote masterpieces, merchants shipped silk by the ton, and the rest of the world looked like a savage horde compared to the capital, Chang'an. And all this luxury collapsed under the weight of peasant uprisings, nomadic raids, and the ambitions of one extremely lazy peasant named Zhu Wen. This guy absolutely hated working on a farm, but he was excellent at butchering people. When rebellion broke out across the country, Zhu Wen joined the rebels, rose to the ranks of a general, and then cynically betrayed his former comrades to the emperor. The emperor was so pleased that he bestowed upon the traitor a new name, one signifying absolute loyalty: a naive fool. Zhu Wen quickly realized that authority was weak, and that power lay with those who wielded swords. He took control of the monarch, slaughtered the court eunuchs, and decided to move the capital to his own lands. He forced millions of residents to leave Chang'an. But simply moving wasn't enough. Zhu Wen ordered the legendary Daming Palace burned. This complex was 3 times larger than Versailles in France, and almost 5 times larger than the later Forbidden City. Within a couple of days, a firestorm reduced the magnificent wooden columns and gardens to charred embers floating down the river. In 907, Zhu Wen finally ended this farce. He forced the last emperor to abdicate, strangled him, and declared himself the new ruler. The Great Golden Age vanished. The vast country shattered into dozens of pieces. Historians call this period the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. In layman's terms, this means an all-out war of all against all. Millions perished from swords, hunger, and cold. But the founder of the new dynasty didn't care. He regained his throne. True, his joy was short-lived. His own son stabbed him to death in his bed a couple of years later. A just end for a traitor. Human nature at its finest. The Crusaders' storming of Jerusalem, 1099 CE. The religious catastrophe that drowned the holy city in rivers of blood and turned ancient temples into vast slaughterhouses reached its climax on July 15, 1099. Prior to this, the European army had been marching through the desert for 3 years. They were coming to kill for their faith. On June 7th, a typhus-ridden crowd of 12,000 crusaders dragged themselves to the walls of Jerusalem. But it was no easy ride. The local ruler, Iftikhar al-Dawla, had prepared himself conscientiously. He expelled all Christians from the city, fearing betrayal. He poisoned all the wells. He cut down all the surrounding trees. The Crusaders found themselves in the middle of a scorching desert, without a drop of clean water or wood for building siege engines. The people were going mad with thirst. They licked dew from stones and fought over slush from the hooves of animals. A complete triumph of human stupidity. But the fanatics were saved by chance. On June 17th, ships from Genoa and England arrived in the port of Jaffa. They brought nails, ropes, and carpenters. The knights dismantled the ships for planks, cut down the remaining scaffolding, and erected 2 wooden towers, each 15 meters high. They also added a heavy battering ram with an iron head. On July 15th, the final assault began. The knights celebrated their victory. A French warrior was the first to scale the wall, followed by a frenzied crowd. The defense crumbled. What followed was sheer carnage. The victors committed total slaughter. They slaughtered Muslims and Jews without regard for gender or age. Eyewitnesses wrote of Christ's pious warriors riding ankle-deep in blood on the Temple Mount. The knights promptly cleared the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock of their former occupants, and converted them into Christian churches. They forced the surviving captives to drag the corpses out of the gates because the stench was unbearable. The victors piled the dead bodies in heaps as high as houses. Historians debate the exact numbers, but approximately 40,000 people perished under the Crusaders' swords. The new rulers joyfully proclaimed the creation of their kingdom, choosing Godfrey of Bouillon as their ruler. They sincerely believed they had accomplished a godly deed. The Aleppo tectonic shift and the Battle of Montcassard, 1138 and 1177 CE. The twin catastrophes of the 12th century, beginning with a monstrous earthquake in Aleppo, Syria, and ending with the rout of a vast Muslim army at Montgassard, demonstrated the futility of human ambitions in the face of the forces of nature and pure fury. October 11th, 1138. The ground beneath Aleppo literally cracked. A seismic shock of incredible force reduced the thriving metropolis to rubble in minutes. Walls collapsed on the heads of those sleeping. The earth opened up. Historians estimate the death toll at 200,000. 200,000 corpses. The city vanished. Families perished under the rubble. Nature shattered the global economy. A devastating tectonic shift destroyed overland trade routes. Merchants could no longer transport silk through the ruins of Syria. Trade instantly shifted to the sea. Ships sailed around. Who profited from this? The Italian ports. Venice and Genoa grew fabulously rich from someone else's tragedy, monopolizing maritime shipping. A cynical business based on bones. Almost 40 years pass. November 25th, 1177. Dusty sands near Montgassard Hill. The great Sultan Saladin leads a vast army from Egypt to wipe the Kingdom of Jerusalem from the map. He has over 20,000 warriors. They are confident of victory. They plunder villages. They divide the spoils. A tiny Christian force marches out to meet this avalanche. Just a few hundred knights and 3,000 foot soldiers. Suicides. But at the head of this detachment stood 16-year-old King Baldwin IV. The boy suffered from severe leprosy. His body was rotting beneath his royal robes. He could barely stay in the saddle. But the cripple's spirit was stronger than steel. Before the battle, Baldwin ordered the raising of the most sacred relic, the true cross. The king slid from his horse and fell to his knees in the hot sand. He prayed furiously for victory. The tortured teenager wept before his warriors. The soldiers roared with rage. They saw their dying leader on his knees and rushed into battle. A terrible battle ensued. Baldwin fought in the thick of the battle, clutching his sword with hands covered in dirty bandages, concealing terrible sores. Saladin had not expected such a furious onslaught. His army fled. The victors chased the enemy 12 miles. Saladin lost 90% of his army. The invincible Sultan himself miraculously escaped, escaping on a swift camel. A young invalid crushed the East's greatest commander to the ground. History loves such mockeries of logic. The Indonesian Semalis explosion and the destruction of Baghdad, 1257 to 1258. The twin nightmares that virtually wiped out humanity's hopes for progress in the 13th century began on opposite ends of the planet, just 1 year apart. 1257. Lombok Island, Indonesia. The Semalis volcano decides to unleash hell. This was no ordinary eruption. Semalis erupted with maximum fury, earning modern scientists a 7. It was the most powerful gas emission in 7,000 years. The volcano spat more than 40 cubic kilometers of rock and tons of sulfur into the sky. An invisible shield tightly blocked the planet from the sun. A harsh volcanic winter began. The summer of 1258 simply never arrived. In England and distant Japan, millions died of hunger and the bitter cold, gathering the rotten remains of crops in the freezing rain. But while nature suffocated the planet with cold, human madness dealt a second fatal blow. February 1258, Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the richest metropolis in the world. The local caliph, al-Mustasim, believed in his own immunity and divine protection. He lazily brushed aside the Mongol demands for surrender. Another stupidity. Genghis Khan's grandson, the cruel Hulagu, led a massive horde to the city walls. The Mongols quickly breached the fortifications and stormed the streets. Chaos ensued. The invaders committed total annihilation. Several 100,000 inhabitants were slaughtered root and branch. But the greatest crime of this horde was the destruction of the House of Wisdom. The libraries of Baghdad had for centuries collected the works of thinkers, mathematicians, and philosophers. This greatest archive of knowledge was simply thrown into the water. In a matter of days, the Tigris River turned black with the ink of priceless manuscripts and red with the blood of murdered scholars. The golden age of Islam ceased to exist in a single week. Knowledge drowned. The survivors were forced to rebuild foreign palaces. One volcano and one savage horde threw humanity back centuries. Nature created a glacier, and humans burned what remained. A perfect union of two great forces of destruction. The Black Death, 1347, a global biological catastrophe that wiped out a third of the population of the European continent within a few years, began in the fall of 1347 in Crimea. It was the 14th century. The trading port of Kaffa, owned by Genoese merchants, was besieged by the army of the Golden Horde. Nomads were dying from an unknown disease right in their camp, but their commander made a devilishly cynical tactical decision. He ordered plague-infested corpses loaded into catapults and hurled over the city walls. The residents of Kaffa found themselves raining down upon themselves with rotting human remains. Death, the perfect biological weapon, had worked flawlessly. The surviving merchants jumped aboard ships and sailed to Italy. Along with silk, they carried black rats covered in plague fleas in their holds. The ships docked in Sicily, and all hell broke loose. The plague spread like wildfire. People were covered in huge black boils, coughing up blood, and dying within 3 days. This was the bubonic plague. Later, it developed into a pneumonic form. Now, just one breath near a sick person was enough to send a person to the next world. Medicine was completely powerless. Doctors advised applying dried toads to the boils or praying. Religious fanatics walked the streets, whipping themselves until they bled. Utter absurdity. The bacteria didn't care about repentance. They methodically devoured human flesh. The Black Death wiped out some 200 million people worldwide. Entire villages disappeared. Fields became overgrown with weeds. Livestock ran away, and there was no one to bury the mountains of corpses. But the most cynical thing is the long-term consequences of this nightmare. Nature carried out a total purge, which suddenly destroyed the centuries-old feudal system. Landowners found no one to work the fields. The surviving peasants quickly realized that their labor was now worth a fortune. They began dictating terms to the lords, demanding freedom and high wages. The plague did more for the rights of the common man than all previous rebellions. The life of a slave became valuable simply because his neighbor had been devoured by bacteria. The deaths of hundreds of millions freed the survivors. Cruel, cynical, but damn effective. The Ottoman breakthrough at Constantinople, 1453. The catastrophe that buried the great, thousand-year-old Byzantine Empire and cut off Europe's oxygen supply on key trade routes unfolded in the spring of 1453 at the walls of Constantinople. It was the 15th century. By this time, Byzantium had shrunk to the size of a single city and a few villages, but its rulers continued to puff themselves up with self-importance. They sat behind the triple walls of Theodosius, naively believing in absolute security. After all, no one had been able to breach these fortifications for 1,000 years. But progress never stands still, and human stubbornness even more so. The young Sultan Mehmed II didn't care about the historical authority of ancient stones. He hauled the latest technological marvel to the city walls, gigantic cannons cast from bronze. The largest of them weighed tons and fired cannonballs weighing almost half a ton, a true nightmare of medieval warfare. The Ottomans simply began methodically reducing the legendary stone defenses to piles of broken brick. The siege lasted nearly 2 months. It was a battle of technology against outdated illusions. On May 29, 1453, the bloody climax arrived. Mehmed II launched his troops into a decisive assault. The defenders fought desperately. The last emperor, Constantine XI, even cast off his royal regalia and went to die in a pile of corpses like a common soldier. Poetic, but utterly futile. The Ottomans found a loophole in the gates, stormed the streets, and rushed toward the center. The eternally vaunted, impregnable city fell in a single day. a true nightmare began. The enraged victors unleashed a total massacre. Tens of thousands of civilians were simply slaughtered on the spot or dragged to slave markets. That same day, Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. European elites were in for a real shock. The region's new ruler instantly cut off the trade routes linking west and east. Spice and silk supply chains crumbled to dust. Merchants howled in grief, and prices soared. But this tragedy had an unexpected side effect. Fleeing Turkish sabers, thousands of Byzantine scholars grabbed their ancient manuscripts and fled to the west. They poured into Italy, bringing with them ancient knowledge that Europeans had conveniently forgotten over centuries of obscurantism. This influx of brains and old books literally exploded the stagnant culture. It launched the Renaissance. The destruction of one empire gave a powerful impetus to the development of another civilization. For Europeans to begin thinking with their heads and creating masterpieces, it was necessary to completely destroy the ancient capital and sell its inhabitants into slavery. Irony of the highest order. The nature of human progress is always built on bones and ashes. The Little Ice Age and the Fall of the Ming Dynasty, 1644. The climatic catastrophe of the Little Ice Age, which turned China's fields into an icy hell and suffocated the Ming Dynasty with famine, reached its climax in the spring of 1644. The 17th century was not kind to people at all. For years, the sun barely penetrated dense clouds of volcanic dust. Temperatures dropped globally, and summers gave way to cold rains. Peasants went without harvests for years. The Great Drought lasted for over 15 years. People ate clay, bark, and the corpses of relatives, while officials demanded taxes. Monarchs naively thought that the throne would stand forever if they performed a few pompous rituals in the temple. A hungry stomach didn't care about rituals. The frenzied mob found a leader in a former postal clerk named Li Zicheng. This young man had simply lost his job due to cost cuts and decided that the best alternative to poverty was rebellion. His army grew like an avalanche. By spring, a ragamuffin horde of nearly 1 million marched under his black banners. They easily routed troops who hadn't received their pay for months. In April, the rebels approached Beijing, and traitors opened the gates to them. The capital's defenses collapsed within a couple of days. The Chongjin Emperor was left completely alone in his vast palace, abandoned by his ministers and guards. Only a very cynical screenwriter could have written the final act of this drama. Instead of attempting to escape, the emperor held a farewell banquet for his family. Chongjin drew his sword and decided to personally spare his loved ones the shame of captivity. He cold-bloodedly slaughtered his wife, concubines, and younger daughters. His second daughter, Princess Chang Ping, attempted to shield herself with her hands. The emperor simply chopped off the girl's left hand and left her on the floor, believing her dead. Afterward, the monarch donned a ceremonial robe, climbed Jingshan Hill behind the palace, and hanged himself from a crooked tree. Before dying, he left a note on his clothes, blaming his deceitful ministers. Stupendous stubbornness. The ruler's death didn't stop the carnage. While Li Zicheng celebrated his victory, the Manchu horde approached the border. The generals of the old regime foolishly opened the gates to the outsiders in an attempt to fight the rebels. The Manchus entered, quickly destroyed Li Zicheng's army, and founded the Qing dynasty. Around 25 million people perished in the chaos. Li Zicheng himself fled the capital and, a year later, was beaten to death by ordinary peasants while trying to steal food from them in a remote village. The former emperor was hanged, his daughter crippled, millions buried in the ground, and the wild northern nomads celebrated their victory. Nature turned on the cold, and humans finished the job themselves. The climatic triumvirate, Lisbon, Laki, and the Chalisa drought, 1755 to 1783. The 18th century climatic triumvirate, which linked the ruins of Lisbon, the poisonous fogs of Iceland, and millions of desiccated corpses in India into a single, deadly chain, began on November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. The Portuguese capital is celebrating. Churches are packed with believers. Candles burn by the thousands. And then, the Earth decides to make a sudden attack. A colossal earthquake devastated the city in minutes. The heavy roofs of cathedrals collapsed on the heads of worshippers. But that was not enough. The survivors fled to the river, hoping to find safety on the embankment. Fools. The water treacherously retreated, exposing the bottom, and then returned as a gigantic tsunami wall. The waves simply wiped out people. The remaining neighborhoods were consumed by fire from fallen church candles. Up to 100,000 people perished. The city was reduced to dust. The vaunted philosophers of the Enlightenment began to stutter and doubt the mercy of the Creator. Welcome to reality. 28 years pass. It's 1783. Iceland. The Laki volcano decides to open a branch of hell. The eruption lasted for months. The volcano spat about 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the sky. This is 3 times the annual industrial emissions of all of modern Europe. A toxic sulfur fog blanketed the continent. People suffocated and died of lung disease in Paris and London. In Iceland itself, toxic ash scorched pastures. Half the livestock died. A quarter of the island's population simply perished from hunger and poisoning. But the climatic echoes of this explosion reverberated far and wide. A sulfur shield in the stratosphere completely disrupted the monsoon circulation over Asia. This coincided with a powerful El Niño climate phenomenon. The result? A complete failure of rain. The earth cracked. The Chalisa drought began. Wheat and millet rotted in the dry dust. Farmers in the Doab, Punjab, and Delhi abandoned their homes in panic. Families fled into the wilderness. People ate dry leaves, wild berries, and tree bark before collapsing dead on the sides of dusty roads. Cholera broke out. Vast swaths of northern India were completely devastated. Between 11 and 20 million people died. Nature doesn't punish. It doesn't care about your prayers in Lisbon or your taxes in Delhi. A plate in the ocean cracks. A hill in the Atlantic wakes up. And on the other side of the world, millions of people die with a piece of tree bark in their teeth. The absurd, blind, and utterly indifferent wheel of history.